Masked female bikers rob a grocery store, not knowing the CCTV caught a shocking detail. The store manager's voice echoed through the near-empty grocery store as the group of masked bikers stormed in. The sleek leather jackets and helmets made it impossible to tell who they were, but their confidence was chilling. The female bikers moved quickly, each heading to different sections, stuffing high-end items and cash from the registers into their backpacks. Shoppers and staff cowered in corners, frozen with fear. But the real shock came later. When the police reviewed the CCTV footage, they noticed something strange. Amid the chaos, one of the bikers briefly removed her helmet to adjust her hair. What caught everyone's attention wasn't her face but a glaring tattoo on her neck, a symbol linked to a controversial hate group. The footage showed her glance directly at the camera before pulling the helmet back on, oblivious to the detail she had just revealed. That tattoo turned the robbery into something far more sinister. The bikers weren't just stealing, they had a darker motive, one hidden behind the robbery. The police froze the footage and zoomed in. Questions swirled. Who were these women? Why were they here, and what was their real purpose? Earlier that day, everything seemed normal at Finley's Market, a small family-owned grocery store in a quiet Midwestern town. Most customers were regulars, greeted by name by the cheerful staff. It was a slow morning, with just a handful of shoppers picking up last-minute items for the weekend. Among them was Mr. Jenkins, an older black man who had lived in the town his whole life. He often joked with the cashier, Sarah, about the weather or his beloved Chicago Bears. Nearby, Maria, a Latina mother of two, browsed the cereal aisle with her toddler in tow, trying to keep him from grabbing everything off the shelves. In the background, the faint hum of the store's radio played soft rock. It was the kind of peaceful day that no one thought could turn dangerous. Around noon, the rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the calm. 3 sleek black bikes pulled into the parking lot, drawing curious glances from a few people outside. The riders, all women, dismounted and marched toward the entrance. Their helmets stayed on, their faces hidden. When they walked in, heads turned. At first, it seemed like they might be just a group of friends passing through town. But their purposeful movements and the way they spread out made the staff uneasy. Sarah exchanged a worried look with her manager, Greg, who had been restocking shelves near the back. Without warning, the tallest biker drew a gun and pointed it at the cash register. "Nobody move," she barked, her voice muffled by the helmet. The other 2 bikers began sweeping through the aisles, tossing items into their bags with practiced speed. The shoppers froze. Mr. Jenkins raised his hands, trying to calm the situation. "Take what you want, just don't hurt anyone," he said gently. His voice was steady, but fear flickered in his eyes. The bikers ignored him. One of them shoved past Maria, knocking a box of cereal out of her hands. Her toddler started crying, his wails piercing the tense silence. Greg, hiding behind a shelf, reached for his phone to call the police. He whispered into the receiver, trying to stay unnoticed. "We're being robbed. Send help." As the bikers moved through the store, their actions became more aggressive. One of them smashed a glass display case near the deli counter, scattering shards everywhere. Another overturned a rack of magazines, seemingly just for the chaos of it. But then came the moment that would later shock everyone watching the footage. Near the canned goods aisle, the shortest biker hesitated. She pulled off her helmet, revealing her face for just a second as she adjusted her long blonde hair. On her neck, the tattoo came into view, a bold, unmistakable emblem that symbolized racial hatred. Greg saw her from his hiding spot and sucked in a breath. She looked directly at the security camera, as if daring it to record her, before slipping the helmet back on and continuing to loot. The robbery lasted less than 10 minutes. By the time the police arrived, the bikers were gone, speeding out of the parking lot and disappearing into the open road. At the police station, the officers reviewed the CCTV footage frame by frame. When they reached the moment the tattoo was visible, the room fell silent. The sheriff, an older man with graying hair, leaned closer to the screen. "Zoom in," he ordered. The officer controlling the playback did as instructed, and the tattoo filled the screen. A younger deputy whistled low under his breath. "That's bad news," he said. The sheriff nodded grimly. "This isn't just a robbery. This is a message." Back at Finley's Market, Greg and Sarah were trying to reassure the shaken customers. Mr. Jenkins sat in a chair near the exit, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Maria was still holding her crying toddler, her hands trembling as she spoke to one of the responding officers. Outside, The media had already arrived. Reporters jostled for interviews, their cameras pointed at the store. The headline practically wrote itself: "Masked female bikers rob grocery store, leaving a trail of fear." But none of them knew about the tattoo yet. The sheriff kept that detail quiet for now. He knew revealing it would spark something bigger, a firestorm that could engulf the whole town. For the moment, the focus was on finding the bikers. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just about the stolen cash or groceries. It was about something much darker, something that could divide the community if it wasn't handled carefully. As the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, Greg sat in his office, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the tattooed biker looking directly into the camera. It was as if she wanted to be seen, to be recognized. A knock at the door startled him. It was Sarah, holding a cup of coffee. "Can you believe what just happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. Greg shook his head. "I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet." Outside, the motorcycles were long gone, their riders blending into the night. But the evidence they left behind, the tattoo, the fear, the questions, would ensure they weren't forgotten anytime soon. And as the first news reports aired, the town braced itself for what would come next. The footage of the robbery, including the tattoo, was now evidence. While the sheriff chose to keep it under wraps for the investigation, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth leaked. He called an emergency town meeting, hoping to address the growing tension without igniting panic. At Finley's Market, Greg and Sarah were cleaning up the mess left behind. Broken glass crunched under their feet as they worked silently. The once bustling store now felt haunted. Every creak of a shelf made them jump, as though the bikers might burst back in at any moment. Outside, Mr. Jenkins stood watching the boarded-up windows. He had lived through tough times and seen prejudice before, but something about this incident unsettled him deeply. The tattoo bothered him, though he hadn't seen it himself. He overheard one of the officers mention it, and his instincts told him there was more to the story. Across town, the bikers regrouped in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts. Their bikes were lined up neatly, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just caused. The leader, a tall woman with sharp features, removed her helmet and threw it onto a nearby table. "Didn't I tell you to keep your helmets on?" she snapped, glaring at the biker with the tattoo. The woman shrugged, unbothered. "It was just for a second." "A second too long," the leader shouted, slamming her fist onto the table. "Do you even know what you've done? That tattoo is going to blow everything up." The others murmured in agreement, but the tattooed biker stayed defiant. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. People need to see what we're about." The leader's expression darkened. "We're not here to make statements. We're here to get what we need and stay off the radar. Do you get that?" The tattooed woman smirked but said nothing. She grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder, walking away from the group. Tension hung in the air as the others watched her leave. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, a heated debate was underway. The sheriff's team wanted to release a public statement to calm the town, but the sheriff wasn't ready. "This isn't just about a robbery," he said, pacing the room. "That tattoo is a symbol. If we release this, we're going to turn this town into a powder keg. We can't hide it forever," one deputy argued. "The media's already sniffing around. If we wait too long, someone else is going to leak it, and it'll look like we're covering it up." The sheriff sighed heavily. He knew the deputy was right. "Okay," he said finally. "But we do this on our terms. I'll call a press conference tomorrow morning. Until then, no one says a word." At Maria's house, she tucked her toddler into bed, but her hands still trembled. The image of the gun, the sound of the glass shattering, it was all too fresh. Her husband, Carlos, sat beside her on the couch, holding her hand. "We should leave," she whispered. "This town isn't safe anymore." Carlos shook his head. "This town is our home. We can't run every time something bad happens." She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's not just the robbery. It's what that tattoo means. People like her, they don't just rob stores. They destroy lives." Carlos didn't respond. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared too. The next morning, the town square was packed. The sheriff stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by officers. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones and cameras trained on him. "Yesterday, Finley's Market was robbed by a group of masked bikers," the sheriff began. "We are doing everything we can to identify and apprehend the suspects. A reporter interrupted, shouting, "What about the tattoo? Is it true one of the bikers had a hate symbol on their neck?" The sheriff hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We are not releasing details about the suspects at this time. Our priority is catching them." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. Murmurs of anger and fear rippled through the onlookers. The town was small enough that everyone knew someone who had been at the store. The robbery felt personal, and the secrecy around the tattoo only fueled speculation. As the sheriff returned to his office, his phone rang. It was Greg. "You need to come back to the store," Greg said, his voice tense. "Something's not right." When the sheriff arrived, Greg led him to the back room where they had stored the surveillance footage. "Look at this," Greg said, pointing to the screen. The sheriff watched as the footage showed the bikers leaving the store. But this time, he noticed something he had missed before. The tattooed biker paused at the door and turned back, looking directly into the camera. She raised her hand, her fingers forming a chilling symbol, a signal that sent shivers down the sheriff's spine. "Did she know we'd see this?" Greg asked. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Oh, she knew. And she wanted us to see it." That evening, the tattooed biker sat alone in the warehouse, watching the news coverage on a small flickering TV. A smug smile played on her lips as the sheriff's press conference aired. She knew they were scared, and she liked it. But she wasn't just sitting idle. She picked up her phone and sent a message to an unknown number. "It's time," she typed. Moments later, a reply came through, "Understood." In the quiet of the night, the warehouse door creaked open, and the rest of the bikers walked in. The leader eyed the tattooed woman suspiciously. "What are you up to?" The tattooed woman stood, her smile never wavering. "Something big. Something they'll never forget." As the clock struck midnight, the sheriff's phone buzzed on his nightstand. Groggy, he answered it, only to hear the panicked voice of a deputy. "Sheriff, you need to get down to the square. There's been another incident." "What happened?" the sheriff demanded, already pulling on his clothes. The deputy's voice shook. "They didn't just rob us, Sheriff. They left a message." The sheriff sped through the empty streets, his siren slicing through the stillness of the night. The town square came into view, but what he saw made his stomach turn. A large burning cross stood in the middle of the square, flames licking the cold night air. Around it, spray-painted in bold red letters on the walls of nearby buildings, was a chilling message: "This is only the beginning." Deputies had already cordoned off the area, their faces grim as they worked to control the fire. A small crowd of residents had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread among them like wildfire. "What does it mean?" one woman asked, clutching her coat tightly. "It's a threat," an older man replied, his voice filled with dread. The sheriff pushed through the crowd and approached the deputies. "What do we know?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. One of the younger officers pointed to the spray-painted message. "It's the same symbol as the tattoo from the footage, Sheriff. They're making a statement." The sheriff clenched his fists. He had spent his career trying to keep the peace in this town, but this was different. This was deliberate, calculated, and it was only escalating. The next morning, the town was buzzing with fear and anger. News of the burning cross spread quickly, dominating conversations at breakfast tables, coffee shops, and church gatherings. Many residents, particularly those from minority communities, felt like targets. Tensions were at an all-time high. At Finley's market, Greg noticed fewer customers than usual. Those who did come in seemed nervous, their eyes darting toward the entrance as if expecting the bikers to return. Mr. Jenkins arrived as usual, but instead of his usual cheerful demeanor, he seemed subdued. "I don't like where this is going, Greg," he said as he paid for his groceries. "This isn't just about money anymore. It's about hate." Greg nodded. "I know. But what can we do?" "The sheriff's doing his best." Mr. Jenkins shook his head. His best might not be enough this time. In the warehouse, the tattooed biker leaned against a table, flipping through photos of the burning cross on her phone. Her smug grin was back. The leader paced the room, furious. "You've gone too far this time," she snapped. "This isn't what we agreed on." The tattooed biker shrugged. "What's the point of all this if we don't make them feel it? They need to know we're here." The leader slammed her fist on the table. "This wasn't the plan. Now the heat's on us, and it's only a matter of time before they find us." Another biker chimed in, trying to mediate. "We've already done the damage. Maybe it's time to lay low." But the tattooed biker wasn't interested in backing down. Laying low is for cowards. They're scared now. We have the power, and I'm not giving it up. The room fell silent. The group was fracturing, and everyone knew it. At the sheriff's office, the team worked around the clock to piece together the bikers' identities. The footage, combined with witness accounts and forensic evidence from the square, gave them a few leads. But it wasn't enough. The sheriff stared at the board filled with photos and notes. His eyes kept returning to the tattoo. He knew the symbol but wished he didn't. It was linked to a notorious hate group that had operated in neighboring states. If these bikers were connected, the town was in far more danger than anyone realized. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Greg. "I need to talk to you," Greg said, looking uneasy. "Make it quick," the sheriff replied. Greg hesitated, then blurted out, "Mr. Jenkins heard something. He thinks one of the bikers might be someone from out of town who used to work here." The sheriff frowned. "Go on." Greg explained that Mr. Jenkins overheard a conversation at the market a few weeks ago. A new face in town had been asking questions about the sheriff's office, the town's demographics, and local businesses. "Why didn't anyone report this sooner?" the sheriff asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Greg shrugged. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time. But now. The sheriff nodded. "Thanks, Greg. Tell Jenkins I'll need him to come in and give a statement." That evening, Maria sat at home with Carlos, watching the news. The footage of the burning cross was on every channel. Her toddler played on the floor, oblivious to the tension in the room. Carlos turned to her. "You were right," he said quietly. "We should leave." Maria shook her head. "It's not that simple. Running won't fix anything. We need to stay and fight this." Carlos sighed. "And what if they come after us next?" Maria didn't have an answer. She just hugged her child tightly, praying they wouldn't become the next victims. Later that night, the sheriff received an anonymous tip. The caller claimed to know where the bikers were hiding. The sheriff hesitated. Anonymous tips were always risky, but he couldn't ignore it. He assembled a team and headed to the location, a rundown building on the edge of town. As they approached, the deputies moved in formation, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The sheriff signaled for his team to move in. They burst through the door, guns drawn. But the building was empty, save for a single item left in the middle of the floor, a biker helmet. The sheriff's stomach sank. This was a trap. Before he could react, an explosion rocked the building, throwing him and his deputies to the ground. The warehouse erupted into flames, and the sound of motorcycle engines roared in the distance. The bikers were gone, but they had left their mark yet again. As the sheriff struggled to his feet, coughing from the smoke, he realized they weren't just playing a game. They were escalating their attacks, and this time, they had sent a clear message: we're always one step ahead. The explosion at the warehouse marked a turning point. The bikers were no longer just robbers, they were terrorists. As firefighters worked to extinguish the flames, the sheriff leaned against his patrol car, his face smeared with soot and his eyes filled with frustration. His deputies, bruised and shaken, huddled nearby. One of the younger officers approached him. "Sheriff, what do we do now? They're not just robbing us anymore. They're making war." The sheriff took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. "We regroup. Tighten our perimeter and double patrols. And no more risks like this until we know exactly where they are." But deep down, he knew the bikers wouldn't stop. They thrived on chaos, and the explosion was proof they were willing to go to any lengths to keep the town on edge. The next morning, the town was on high alert. News of the explosion spread quickly, and fear turned to anger. At a town hall meeting, residents packed the small room, demanding answers from the sheriff. "This has gone too far," shouted a middle-aged man near the front. "What are you doing to stop these people?" "They're targeting us because of who we are," cried an elderly woman. "Why haven't you arrested them yet?" The sheriff raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. "We're doing everything we can. This is a calculated group. They're not just criminals, they're extremists. But we're working around the clock to bring them to justice." "That's not enough," someone yelled from the back. "You're supposed to protect us." Before the sheriff could respond, Mr. Jenkins stood up. His calm, steady voice carried over the noise. "Everyone here is scared, and rightfully so. But turning on each other won't solve anything. The sheriff needs our support to get through this. The room quieted. While some nodded in agreement, others remained skeptical. The sheriff gave Mr. Jenkins a grateful look, but he knew the town's patience was wearing thin. At their new hideout deep in the woods, the bikers gathered around a map spread across a table. The tattooed woman, now firmly taking the reins of the group, pointed to several locations in town. "We've hit the market, the square, and the cop's little trap," she said with a smirk. "Now it's time to go bigger." The leader, still visibly uneasy about the escalation, crossed her arms. "What's your endgame here? At this rate, it's only a matter of time before they catch us." The tattooed woman rolled her eyes. "You're thinking too small. This isn't just about money or survival. It's about sending a message. We're here to expose their weakness, their fear." The others exchanged nervous glances. Some were clearly uncomfortable, but the tattooed woman's confidence was intoxicating. Reluctantly, they nodded. Back in town, Maria and Carlos were among the many families considering their next move. Sitting at their kitchen table, they weighed their options. "We can't keep living like this," Maria said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Every night, I wake up thinking they're outside our door." Carlos nodded. "Maybe we should stay with your sister in Chicago for a while. At least until things calm down." Maria hesitated. She didn't want to leave, but she also didn't want to put her family in danger. What about the store? The people here? If everyone leaves, who's left to fight for this town? Carlos didn't have an answer. The choice between safety and standing their ground was tearing them apart. The sheriff, now working with state and federal authorities, finally caught a break. The tattooed biker's image, enhanced from the footage, was circulated to neighboring jurisdictions. A hit came back. Her name was Ashley Gorman, and she had a long history of involvement with extremist groups. Armed with this information, the sheriff called a press conference. Standing before the cameras, he addressed the town and the nation. "We have identified one of the suspects in these attacks as Ashley Gorman," he announced. "She is considered armed and dangerous, and we urge anyone with information on her whereabouts to come forward." The tattooed woman watched the broadcast from a dingy motel room. She smiled as her face appeared on the screen. "Looks like I'm famous now," she said, turning to one of her crew. "Time to give them something to really talk about." That night, Finley's Market became their next target. Greg was locking up when he heard the low rumble of motorcycles in the distance. His heart raced as the sound grew louder. He quickly grabbed his phone to call the sheriff, but before he could dial, the roar stopped, and the market's front windows shattered. A Molotov cocktail sailed through the air, igniting the store in seconds. Greg barely managed to escape through the back door, coughing from the thick smoke. Outside, he saw the bikers speeding away, their laughter echoing in the night. Flames consumed the store as Greg watched helplessly, tears streaming down his face. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The market, a cornerstone of the community, was reduced to ashes. The next morning, the town woke to the devastating news. Finley's Market wasn't just a store, it was a symbol of the town's unity, a place where everyone felt welcome. Its destruction felt like a personal attack on every resident. The sheriff stood outside the smoldering remains, his jaw tight with anger. "This isn't just a crime anymore," he said to his deputies. "This is war." Greg approached him, his face pale and his voice trembling. "They're not going to stop, Sheriff. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Not if we stop them first." As the town mourned the loss of Finley's Market, Ashley and her crew prepared for their next move. This time, they weren't just targeting buildings. They were targeting people. The destruction of Finley's Market sent shockwaves through the town, uniting the residents in grief and outrage. The once quiet community was now under siege, and everyone knew it. While the sheriff and his team scrambled to contain the chaos, Ashley and her crew plotted their most brazen act yet, an attack meant to divide the town even further. The sheriff was in his office, surrounded by maps, files, and half-empty cups of coffee. Every lead pointed to the bikers becoming more aggressive. He stared at Ashley Gorman's mugshot, her cold smirk haunting him. "We need to find her," he said to his deputy, who stood nervously by the door, "before she makes good on whatever she's planning next." The deputy hesitated. "Sheriff, there's something you need to see." He handed over a photograph taken by a patrol officer earlier that day. It showed a spray-painted message on the side of a local church, Tonight. 10 p.m. The sheriff slammed his fist on the desk. They're taunting us. What should we do? The deputy asked. Get every available officer on this. If they're coming for the church, we'll be ready. That evening, the town square was eerily quiet. The church in question, a historic building with deep ties to the black community, loomed in the darkness. Inside, the congregation had gathered for a prayer vigil. Despite the fear gripping the town, they refused to be intimidated. Mr. Jenkins stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. We've seen dark times before, but we've always come through stronger. We must stand together now more than ever. Outside, the sheriff and his deputies kept watch. Patrol cars were stationed at every corner, and plainclothes officers blended into the small crowd of onlookers. The tension was palpable. Then, at exactly 10 p.m., the sound of motorcycles broke the silence. The congregation froze as the roar of engines grew louder. The sheriff's hand tightened around his radio. They're here, he said, signaling his team to prepare. Ashley and her crew stopped at the edge of the square, their bikes gleaming under the streetlights. They dismounted slowly, their movements deliberate. Ashley removed her helmet, her face defiant and smug. The tattoo on her neck caught the light, drawing gasps from onlookers. The sheriff stepped forward, his weapon drawn. Ashley Gorman. You're under arrest. Drop your weapons and surrender. Ashley smirked. Arrest me? Sheriff, I think you're outnumbered. From the shadows, more bikers emerged, dozens of them. The deputies looked around nervously, realizing they were surrounded. Ashley raised her hand, signaling her crew to hold their ground. We're not here to fight, she said, her voice carrying across the square. We're here to deliver a message. She turned toward the church, her eyes cold. This town is a symbol of everything wrong with this country. Weakness. Division. It's time to tear it down. Before the sheriff could respond, one of the bikers tossed something into the air, a flare. It arced high before landing on the roof of the church, igniting instantly. No, the sheriff shouted, rushing toward the building as flames spread rapidly. Deputies and townspeople scrambled to put out the fire, but the bikers had already mounted their bikes and disappeared into the night. The next morning, the church stood charred and broken, its once proud steeple reduced to rubble. The congregation gathered outside, their faces etched with grief. This isn't just about hate, Mr. Jenkins said, his voice trembling. This is about destroying our community. Maria stood beside him, her toddler clutching her leg. What do we do now? She asked, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Jenkins looked toward the sheriff, who stood near the wreckage, his hat in his hands. We fight back. But not with violence. We fight by refusing to give in to fear. At the sheriff's office, tensions were high. The attack on the church was a turning point, and the sheriff knew he needed to act fast. He called in federal reinforcements, knowing the bikers were far beyond his small-town force's capabilities. Every second we wait, they're planning their next move, he told the FBI agent assigned to the case. The agent, a no-nonsense woman named Agent Carter, nodded. We've been tracking Ashley Gorman's network for years. This is her pattern: escalate, divide and disappear. But this time, she's left too many breadcrumbs. We'll catch her. The sheriff wasn't convinced. You better. This town can't take much more. In their new hideout, Ashley and her crew celebrated their latest attack. The tattooed woman poured drinks as the others laughed and shared stories of the chaos they had caused. The leader, now a reluctant participant, pulled Ashley aside. This is getting out of hand. Burning a church? Do you know how far you've gone? Ashley shrugged. Far enough to make them scared. That's the point. It's not just them, the leader said. It's us. People are talking about leaving the crew. They didn't sign up for this. Ashley's eyes narrowed. If they want to leave, let them. But they better not stand in my way. That night, as the town mourned the loss of the church, a new threat loomed. Ashley sent a cryptic message to a local news station, claiming responsibility for the attack and promising something even bigger. This is only the beginning, the message read. Your town will never be the same. The sheriff read the message aloud to his deputies, his face pale. We need to figure out what they're planning, he said. And we need to stop them before it's too late. But Ashley was always one step ahead, and the next strike would hit closer to home than anyone expected. The sheriff didn't sleep that night. Ashley's cryptic message echoed in his mind. your town will never be the same. Every detail of the attack so far pointed to a larger plan, but what could be bigger than burning a church? He paced his office, reviewing every file, photo, and report, hoping for a breakthrough. Then his phone buzzed. It was Agent Carter. "We traced the message to a burner phone," she said. "But we found something else. Ashley's crew recently rented a storage unit under a fake name. We're getting a warrant now." The sheriff grabbed his coat. "Where is it?" "Edge of town, near the old rail yard," Carter replied. "I'll meet you there." The storage facility was a grim, industrial stretch of rusted buildings and cracked pavement. The sheriff's heart pounded as he pulled up, his headlights cutting through the fog. Carter and her team were already there, armed and ready. "This could be it," Carter said. "But stay sharp. If Ashley's involved, there's no telling what we'll find." The warrant was executed quickly. Officers cut the lock on the storage unit and swung the door open. Inside, the sight made the sheriff's blood run cold. The walls were lined with maps, photos, and notes. Strings connected key locations across the town: Finley's Market, the church, the square, and more. In the center of the room stood a large wooden crate. When Carter pried it open, her face hardened. "Explosives. This isn't just about making statements," Carter said grimly. "They're planning to take out a major target." The sheriff scanned the maps, his eyes landing on the town civic center, circled in bold red marker. "It's the civic center," he said. "Tomorrow night. There's a fundraiser for the school district. Half the town will be there." Carter nodded. "We need to evacuate and secure the area immediately." The next morning, the sheriff called another town meeting. The civic center buzzed with nervous energy as residents packed the room, their whispers growing louder. When the sheriff stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. "We have credible information that the bikers are planning another attack," he said. "We've identified the civic center as the likely target." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Maria, clutching her toddler, raised her hand. "Are we safe here? Should we leave town?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. "We're taking every precaution. But I won't lie to you, this group is dangerous. If you feel safer leaving, no one will blame you." Mr. Jenkins stood, his voice firm. "This is our home. We've faced hate before, and we're still here. I'm not going anywhere." His words rallied some, but others exchanged worried glances. The town was on the edge of breaking, and everyone felt it. At the hideout, Ashley sat at the head of the table, her crew gathered around her. The tension was palpable. Some members whispered among themselves, clearly uneasy with the escalating violence. One of the younger bikers spoke up. "Ashley, this is too much. We didn't sign up to hurt people. Burning a church was bad enough, but bombing a fundraiser." Ashley's icy gaze silenced him. "This isn't a democracy," she said. "If you can't handle the heat, leave. But you better not get in my way." The biker hesitated, then stood. "I'm out." As he turned to leave, Ashley nodded to one of her loyalists. The biker barely made it 2 steps before he was grabbed and forced into a chair. "No one leaves," Ashley said coldly. "Not alive, anyway." The room went silent. The remaining crew members exchanged terrified looks but said nothing. Ashley smirked, satisfied. "Good. Now let's finish what we started." That night, the sheriff received an anonymous call. It was the young biker who had tried to leave Ashley's crew. His voice was shaky but determined. "She's going to bomb the civic center tomorrow night," he said. "She's using the fundraiser as cover." The sheriff sat upright. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know. Just stop her. Before it's too late." The call ended abruptly, but the sheriff didn't hesitate. He called Carter and set the plan in motion. The civic center would be evacuated, and an ambush would be set for Ashley and her crew. The next evening, the civic center was eerily quiet. Rows of chairs and tables, decorated for the fundraiser, sat empty. Law enforcement officers were stationed at every corner, hidden from view. Carter stood beside the sheriff, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. "They'll show," she said confidently. Ashley's too arrogant to back down. The minutes ticked by, the tension growing unbearable. Then, at precisely 8 p.m., the rumble of motorcycles echoed through the streets. "They're here," the sheriff said into his radio. "Everyone, hold your positions." Ashley's crew rolled into the parking lot, their bikes gleaming under the streetlights. She dismounted and motioned for two of her men to approach the building with a crate of explosives. They moved with precision, unaware they were being watched. As they reached the doors, Carter gave the signal. Officers surrounded the bikers, weapons drawn. Freeze. Hands in the air. Chaos erupted. Ashley's crew scattered, some trying to fight, others attempting to flee. Ashley herself darted back to her bike, but the sheriff was faster. He tackled her to the ground, pinning her wrists behind her back. "It's over, Ashley," he said through gritted teeth. But Ashley only laughed. "You think this stops me? You have no idea what's coming." The sheriff ignored her as Carter disarmed the crate. "Bomb secure," she said, breathing a sigh of relief. Back at the station, Ashley sat in an interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table. The sheriff and Carter stood on the other side of the glass, watching her. "She's not talking," Carter said. "But we have enough to put her away for life." The sheriff wasn't satisfied. "There's more to this. She's part of something bigger. We need to find out what." As they watched, Ashley leaned back in her chair, her smirk never fading. It was as if she was waiting for something they hadn't yet seen. The sheriff and Agent Carter studied Ashley through the glass, her smug expression unsettling them both. Every attempt to question her had been met with silence or cryptic remarks, leaving them with more questions than answers. "She's too calm," Carter said, her voice low. "She's either planning something or knows something we don't." The sheriff nodded. "We need to break her fast. If there's more out there, we can't afford to wait." Inside the interrogation room, Ashley remained unfazed, her eyes locked on the two-way mirror. The sheriff entered, pulling out a chair across from her and setting a file on the table. "Let me guess," Ashley said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "This is the part where you try to scare me into talking?" The sheriff ignored her, opening the file to reveal photos of the destruction she'd caused, the charred remains of the church, the burned-out shell of Finley's market, and the map of the town they'd found in the storage unit. "This is what you've done," he said, his tone steady but firm. "You've destroyed lives, torn apart a community, and for what? A message." Ashley leaned forward, her smirk widening. "You still don't get it, do you? This town was already broken. I just lit the match." The sheriff slammed the file shut. "We've got enough to put you away for the rest of your life. But if you think you're some kind of martyr, you're wrong. We're taking down every one of your crew." Ashley's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Good luck with that," she said. "You'll never catch all of us." The sheriff stood, his patience wearing thin. "We'll see about that." Outside the room, Carter was poring over Ashley's phone records. "She's been in contact with someone high up," she said, pointing to a string of encrypted messages. "But the encryption is military grade. It'll take time to crack." "We don't have time," the sheriff replied. "Whoever she's working with is still out there." Just then, an officer burst into the room. "Sheriff, we've got a situation. One of the bikers we arrested tried to escape during transport. He didn't make it, but he said something before he died." "What did he say?" Carter asked. The officer hesitated. "He said, 'The clock is ticking.'" Meanwhile, Ashley's crew, now fractured and desperate, regrouped in a remote location outside town. Their leader was gone, and their numbers had dwindled after the ambush at the Civic Center. Fear and paranoia gripped the remaining members. One of them, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, paced the room. "We're screwed," he muttered. "Ashley's gone, half the crew's locked up, and the cops are closing in." Another member, a burly woman with a scar across her cheek, slammed her fist on the table. "We stick to the plan. Ashley knew this might happen. She left us instructions." The wiry man stopped pacing. "What instructions?" The woman pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "We hit their water supply." Gasps filled the room. "Are you crazy?" one of them shouted. "Poisoning the water? That's going too far." The woman glared at him. "Ashley said this town needs to be punished. If we back out now, we're as good as dead." At the sheriff's office, the tension was palpable. Carter's team had finally cracked the encryption on Ashley's phone, revealing a chilling discovery, a blueprint of the town's water treatment plant. The sheriff's heart sank. "They're going after the water supply." Carter nodded grimly. "If they poison it, the entire town could be at risk. We need to move now." They scrambled to assemble a team, racing against time to prevent another disaster. As they sped toward the treatment plant, The sheriff's mind raced. Ashley's smug confidence suddenly made sense. Even in custody, she was still orchestrating the chaos. At the treatment plant, Ashley's crew was already inside, planting chemicals near the main filtration system. The burly woman barked orders, her eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of interference. "We're almost done," she said, glancing at her watch. 10 minutes, and we're out of here." The wiry man hesitated, his hands shaking as he handled the chemicals. "Are you sure about this? What if it doesn't work?" The woman grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close. "It'll work. Now shut up and do your job." But before they could finish, the sheriff's team stormed the building. "Hands up. Drop everything." Carter shouted, her weapon drawn. Panic erupted. Some of the bikers surrendered immediately, while others tried to fight. The burly woman lunged at the sheriff, wielding a wrench, but he dodged and tackled her to the ground. The wiry man, frozen in fear, dropped the chemicals and raised his hands. "Don't shoot. I'll talk. I'll talk." Within minutes, the bikers were subdued, and the plant was secured. The sheriff surveyed the scene, relief washing over him. They had stopped the attack just in time. Back at the station, the wiry man sat in an interrogation room, his hands trembling. "Ashley planned everything," he said. "The market, the church, the bomb. It was all to distract you. The water was her real goal." "Why?" the sheriff asked. "She wanted to make the town unlivable," the man replied. "She said it was the only way to purge the weak." The sheriff's jaw tightened. Ashley's ideology wasn't just about hate, it was about complete destruction. In her cell, Ashley sat calmly, her expression unreadable. When the sheriff confronted her with a failed water attack, she only shrugged. "You stopped one plan," she said. "But you can't stop them all." "What's that supposed to mean?" the sheriff demanded. Ashley leaned closer to the bars, her voice low. "The clock is still ticking, Sheriff. And you're running out of time." The sheriff left Ashley's cell feeling a gnawing sense of dread. Every word she spoke felt calculated, designed to keep him and his team on edge. Back in his office, Agent Carter was waiting, her face etched with concern. "She's playing with us," Carter said. "That line about the clock ticking, it's meant to rattle you." "Well, it's working," the sheriff admitted, rubbing his temples. "We stopped the water attack, but if Ashley's got more plans out there, we're in trouble." Carter placed a folder on his desk. "We've been digging into her communications. She's connected to an extremist cell operating across several states. The group is decentralized, but their tactics are similar: chaos, fear, destruction. This isn't just about our town, it's part of something much bigger." The sheriff flipped through the folder, his jaw tightening. "How do we stop it?" Carter sighed. "We cut off the head of the snake. Ashley's crew is in shambles, but if she's still calling the shots, the danger hasn't passed." Meanwhile, Ashley's remaining crew, now scattered and desperate, sought refuge wherever they could. The burly woman, who had managed to escape during the raid at the water plant, huddled in an abandoned warehouse with 2 loyal members. "We need to regroup," she said, pacing the room. "Ashley left us instructions for a backup plan." One of the bikers, a younger man with a nervous energy, spoke up. "Backup? After everything that's happened? The others are gone, the cops are everywhere, and Ashley's locked up. Maybe it's time to call it quits." The woman spun on him, her eyes blazing. "Call it quits? You think Ashley would give up this fight? If you're too scared, then leave. But if you stay, you follow my lead." The younger man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "What's the plan?" The woman pulled out a battered notebook, flipping to a page marked with Ashley's handwriting. "We're going after the town's power grid. One blackout, and the entire place will descend into chaos." At the station, the sheriff and Carter continued piecing together the threads of Ashley's network. The wiry man who had surrendered at the water plant was proving to be a valuable source of information, though his nerves made the process slow. "There's something else," the man said during another interrogation. "Ashley always talked about the grid. Said it was the town's Achilles heel." Carter's eyes narrowed. "The power grid?" The man nodded. "She called it Plan Omega. If everything else failed, that's where we'd hit. She said no town can function without power." The sheriff stood abruptly. "We need to secure the grid immediately." Carter agreed, already reaching for her phone. "I'll alert my team. We can't let this happen." The power station, located on the outskirts of town, was an unassuming building surrounded by chain-link fencing. To most, it was just a piece of infrastructure, unnoticed and taken for granted. But to Ashley and her crew, it was a weapon. That night, the burly woman and her 2 followers approached the station, dressed in dark clothing and carrying tools. They cut through the fence with practiced efficiency, moving silently toward the main control room. "Stick to the plan," the woman whispered. "Disable the backup systems first, then overload the main transformers." Unknown to them, the sheriff and Carter had anticipated their move. Officers were stationed throughout the property, watching and waiting. As the bikers entered the building, Carter gave the signal. "Go," she shouted, and her team moved in. The bikers scattered, but the sheriff was ready. He tackled the burly woman just as she reached for a control panel, pinning her to the ground. One of her followers was caught trying to climb the fence, while the other managed to slip into the shadows. The sheriff hauled the woman to her feet, his voice low and firm. "It's over." But she only sneered. "You think stopping me stops the plan? You're too late." At the station, the woman refused to talk. Carter's team analyzed the notebook they had confiscated during her arrest, finding detailed schematics of the power grid and notes on contingency plans. "This wasn't just about the power," Carter said, pointing to a section of the notes. "They were planning to use the blackout as cover for something bigger." "But what?" The sheriff frowned. "Bigger than crippling the town's infrastructure? What's left?" The answer came later that night. An anonymous tip led officers to a storage locker on the far side of town. Inside, they found crates filled with weapons and explosives. Among them was a handwritten note. "You've stopped the grid, but you can't stop what's coming. The clock is still ticking." The sheriff's heart sank. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." Back in her cell, Ashley leaned against the wall, humming softly to herself. When a guard approached to deliver her meal, she looked up and smiled. "You seem awfully happy for someone who's lost," the guard said, setting the tray down. Ashley chuckled. "Lost? You think this is about winning or losing? It's about the message." The guard shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. As soon as he was gone, Ashley pulled a small, hidden device from her sleeve. She pressed a button, and a faint red light blinked to life. Across town, a similar device hidden in the storage locker began to beep. The sheriff was still at his desk when the call came in. "Sheriff, we've got a problem," a deputy said, his voice panicked. "The storage locker, it's rigged to blow." "How long do we have?" the sheriff demanded, already grabbing his coat. "Not long. Maybe 10 minutes. The sheriff raced toward the site, his sirens wailing. In the distance, he saw the glow of flashing lights and the shadows of his team scrambling to evacuate the area. The storage locker was in a densely populated area, and if it went off, the casualties would be devastating. As the sheriff arrived, Carter ran up to him. "The bomb squad's on their way, but we don't know if they'll make it in time." The sheriff nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the blinking red light visible through the locker's open door. "Then we'll have to stop it ourselves." The storage locker glowed ominously, the faint beeping of the bomb filling the air with tension. The sheriff and Agent Carter stood just outside, staring at the blinking red light that seemed to grow faster with every second. "We don't have time to wait," Carter said, her voice sharp. "If that thing goes off, it's going to take out half this block." The sheriff nodded. "What are we dealing with?" Carter peered inside. "Looks like a series of linked charges, amateur wiring, but enough firepower to cause serious damage. Whoever set this up wasn't just trying to scare us." The sheriff took a deep breath. "What do we do?" Carter glanced at him. "We disable it. You good with steady hands?" "I guess we're about to find out." Inside the locker, the beeping was louder, more insistent. Carter carefully examined the bomb, her flashlight illuminating the tangled mess of wires. She pointed to a cluster near the base of the device. "This is the trigger mechanism," she said. "Cut the wrong wire, and it'll blow." The sheriff crouched beside her, his hands sweating despite the cold night air. "Which one do I cut?" Carter hesitated, her eyes scanning the setup. "Red wire. It's always the red wire." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's comforting." Before he could act, his radio crackled. "Sheriff, bomb squad's 3 minutes out," a deputy reported. "We don't have 3 minutes," the sheriff replied. "We're handling it." He reached for the wire cutters, his hands trembling slightly. Carter steadied him with a firm grip on his arm. "Breathe," she said. You've got this. The sheriff exhaled slowly, then moved the cutters toward the red wire. The beeping seemed to mock him, growing faster as the seconds ticked by. Snip. The beeping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. The sheriff and Carter exchanged a glance, then a collective sigh of relief. "We're good," Carter said into her radio. "Device is disarmed." Back at the station, the sheriff collapsed into his chair, exhausted. Carter stood across from him, arms crossed. "We got lucky," she said. "But there's no telling how many more traps they've set." The sheriff rubbed his temples. This wasn't just a distraction. It was meant to destroy everything we've worked to stop. Carter nodded. "Ashley's playing the long game. Even in custody, she's pulling the strings." Meanwhile, Ashley sat in her cell, her expression unreadable. When the guard came by for his routine check, she spoke for the first time since her arrest. "Tick-tock," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to make the guard pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. Ashley leaned back, her smirk returning. "You'll find out soon enough." The guard shook his head and walked away, but her words left a chill in the air. The next morning, the sheriff and Carter interrogated the burly woman they had arrested at the power station. She remained defiant, refusing to cooperate. "You think you've won," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think catching me and Ashley means you've stopped this?" "We stopped the bomb," Carter replied. "We stopped your crew. You're running out of moves." The woman laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You don't get it. This isn't about moves. This is about sending a message that'll live on long after we're gone." The sheriff leaned forward. "Then tell us. What's the end game?" The woman's eyes gleamed with malice. "You'll see." Later that day, Carter's team found more evidence hidden in the notes confiscated from Ashley's crew. Among the scribbled plans and diagrams was a reference to a date, tomorrow. Beside it was a single word, rally. "What kind of rally?" the sheriff asked, frowning. Carter shook her head. "No idea. But whatever it is, it's happening soon." The sheriff grabbed his radio. "I want every available officer on this. Find out where it's happening and shut it down." That evening, the town square became the center of attention once again. A crowd of masked individuals began gathering, their presence unnerving residents who peered from behind curtains and locked doors. Carter's team monitored from a distance, using drones and undercover agents to assess the situation. What they found was disturbing: a group of Ashley's followers rallying around her ideology, chanting slogans of hate and destruction. The sheriff stood with Carter, watching the live feed from one of the drones. "She's building a movement," he said grimly. "This isn't just about us anymore." Suddenly, the crowd grew louder, their chants reaching a fever pitch. One of the undercover officers radioed in. "They've got weapons. Something's about to go down." Carter nodded. "Move in now. We can't let this escalate." The confrontation in the square was swift and chaotic. Officers moved in from all sides, dispersing the crowd and confiscating weapons. Some of the protesters fled, while others resisted, resulting in several arrests. Amid the chaos, the sheriff spotted someone familiar, a biker from Ashley's crew who had slipped through their grasp before. He pursued her through the narrow streets, his footsteps echoing in the night. When he finally caught up, she turned to face him, her hands raised. "You're too late," she said, a manic smile spreading across her face. "Too late for what?" the sheriff demanded. "For the real rally," she replied. "The one that's already started." At that moment, his radio crackled. "Sheriff, we've got reports of a disturbance at the old mill on the outskirts of town. Could be another rally." The sheriff's blood ran cold. "Get everyone there now." As the sheriff raced toward the mill, Carter's voice came through his radio. "Be careful. If Ashley's people are there, this could be the endgame." The sheriff gritted his teeth. "Then we end it tonight." The sheriff's car screeched to a halt near the old mill, its decaying structure looming against the dark sky. The distant sound of chanting and rumbling motorcycles sent a chill through the night air. Deputies and agents formed a perimeter, their faces tense and ready for action. Agent Carter approached the sheriff. "We've got confirmation. Ashley's remaining crew is inside, and they're armed. There's also a crowd of civilians. They've been lured here, probably under false pretenses." "Do we know what they're planning?" the sheriff asked. "Not exactly," Carter replied. "But given the explosives we've already seen, We can't take any chances. We go in now. The sheriff nodded. Let's move. Inside the mill, Ashley's loyalists had gathered the crowd under the pretense of a rally to take back their town. The burly woman, now assuming leadership in Ashley's absence, stood on a makeshift stage, shouting into a megaphone. "This town has forgotten who it belongs to," she yelled, her voice echoing off the mill's rusted walls. "But tonight, we remind them." Behind her, two bikers worked frantically, assembling what appeared to be another bomb, larger and more sophisticated than the last. A timer was already ticking down, 1,500 hours. Among the crowd, a few people began to realize something was off. Whispers spread, and some tried to leave, only to find the exits blocked by armed bikers. One young man, wearing a hoodie and trying to stay unnoticed, slipped his phone out and dialed 911. "They've got a bomb," he whispered. "We're trapped." Outside, the sheriff's radio crackled. "Call from inside the mill. Confirmed bomb threat. Timer's running." The sheriff turned to Carter. "We're out of time." Carter motioned to her team. "We breach on my signal. Secure the civilians first, then the bomb." The sheriff's heart pounded as he followed the team into the building. The air inside was thick with tension, the noise of the rally masking their approach. "Move in," Carter commanded. Officers stormed the room, shouting orders. "This is the police. Everyone on the ground. Hands up." Chaos erupted. The crowd scattered, some civilians running for cover while the bikers fought back. Gunfire echoed through the mill as deputies worked to subdue the attackers. The sheriff spotted the bomb in the corner of the room, its timer now showing 7:43. He and Carter sprinted toward it, dodging debris and struggling bikers. "This one's more complex," Carter said, examining the device. "We'll need the bomb squad." "They won't make it in time," the sheriff replied. "Can we disable it?" Carter shook her head. "Not without triggering it. We need to evacuate." But before they could move, the burly woman appeared, blocking their path. She held a gun, her expression wild and unhinged. "You think you can stop this?" she sneered. "You can't stop what's already begun." The sheriff raised his weapon. "Drop the gun. It's over." She laughed bitterly. "You don't get it. This isn't just a bomb. It's a symbol. And symbols last forever." As she raised her weapon, Carter fired, hitting her in the shoulder. She fell with a scream, her gun clattering to the ground. The crowd was nearly evacuated, but the bomb continued to tick down, 3:12. "We're running out of time," Carter said, pulling the sheriff back toward the device. "We can't disarm it, but we might be able to move it." "With what?" the sheriff asked, scanning the room. Carter spotted a metal trolley near a stack of old machinery. "That'll do. Help me." The two of them heaved the bomb onto the trolley, the timer now at 2:45. Sweating and breathing heavily, they pushed it toward the exit. Outside, deputies cleared a path as the bomb was wheeled into the open air. Carter pointed to a drainage canal running alongside the property. "There. Dump it in the water, it'll absorb some of the blast." With every ounce of strength they had, they pushed the trolley to the edge and tipped it over. The bomb plunged into the canal, its timer flashing 0:12 as it disappeared beneath the surface. The explosion rocked the ground, sending a geyser of water and debris into the air. The crowd, now safely at a distance, screamed and ducked for cover. When the dust settled, the canal was left a smoldering ruin, but the town had been spared. The sheriff and Carter collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Around them, deputies rounded up the remaining bikers, including the injured leader. "You did it," Carter said, looking at the sheriff. "You stopped her." He shook his head. "Not just me. All of us." Back at the station, Ashley watched the news coverage of the mill raid from her cell. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, hard glare. A guard passed by, stopping briefly. "Looks like your plan didn't work." Ashley met his gaze, her voice low. "You think this ends with me? There are more out there. And they're watching." The guard shook his head and walked away, but Ashley's words lingered. In the days that followed, the town began to rebuild. The sheriff, Carter, and their teams worked tirelessly to dismantle the remnants of Ashley's network. The community, though shaken, rallied together, determined to overcome the scars left by the attacks. At a town meeting, Mr. Jenkins addressed the crowd. "We've seen the worst of what hate can do, but we've also seen the best of what we can be when we stand together. This is our town, And we won't let anyone take it from us." The room erupted in applause, the first sign of hope in weeks. As the sheriff drove home that night, the quiet streets seemed peaceful again. But in the back of his mind, Ashley's words echoed, "There are more out there." For now, the town was safe. But the fight against hate was far from over.